Hey everyone, Romeo here, a fellow Spanish language learner. Recently, I was reading a comment about how Spanish learners often get in their own way. And honestly, I think that's true. But I also think learners can't entirely help it when so much language learning advice is packaged as abstract ideas. Think in Spanish, just listen more, just speak more, just watch hundreds of hours of comprehensible input and wait for it to turn into spoken Spanish. So let's talk about it. The problem is that none of those things tell someone what they should actually do today. That's one of the reasons why this channel exists. I like challenging these ideas because many of them sound helpful on the surface, but when you look closely, they're often too vague to be useful and collapse under their own logic. And one piece of advice I've never completely agreed with is the idea that you shouldn't translate and that instead you should just think in Spanish. I think that's where the confusion starts. People talk about thinking in Spanish as if it means not translating, and they talk about translating as if it means not really thinking. But I don't think that's right. Translating is thinking. It's the mental process of connecting an idea you understand to a structure you're trying to produce. The real question isn't whether you're translating. The real question is how quickly those associations happen. Because when someone says they're thinking in Spanish, what they're usually describing is not the absence of translation. They're describing a level of automaticity where the associations happen so quickly that the translation process becomes invisible. So the idea of you should think in Spanish and not translate is crazy to me. How can someone even begin thinking in Spanish if they don't yet have the Spanish to produce? What exactly are you supposed to do? Let's take something simple like a noun. If I point to an apple and I say manzana enough times, eventually that association becomes automatic. That makes sense. But language isn't just nouns. Language is sentences. Language is relationships between ideas. Language is structures. And that's where the advice starts to fall apart. Take a sentence like, if I knew today what I knew yesterday. You can't point at that. You can't hold it in your hand. You can't simply look at an object and associate it with a Spanish word. You have to first understand the idea that you're trying to express. Then you have to know how Spanish expresses that idea. Then you have to connect those two things together. And that's exactly what language learning is. It's building associations, thousands and thousands of associations. And over time, the gap between the English thought and the Spanish expression gets smaller and smaller. At first, it's slow, then it's faster, and then eventually it feels instant. And that's the point where people start saying they're thinking in Spanish. But from my perspective, what really happened wasn't that they suddenly learned how to think in Spanish. What happened is that the associations became so strong that the conversion process became automatic. The translation became invisible. And I think that's an important distinction. The question isn't whether translation eventually becomes less noticeable. The question is how you get there. And I don't think the answer is trying harder to think in Spanish. I think the answer is building enough repetition that the Spanish starts showing up automatically. Those are two very different things. Think about driving a car. When you first learned to drive a car, every action felt deliberate. You checked the mirrors, you looked at the road, you checked your signal, you checked your brake, you checked your turns. Everything required conscious attention. A few years later, you're driving somewhere and suddenly you realize you didn't remember the last 10 minutes of the trip. The actions didn't disappear, they became compressed. Language works the same way. So telling a beginner to think in Spanish is like telling a beginner guitarist to think like a musician. It sounds useful, but it doesn't tell them what to practice. After almost 3 years of learning Spanish, I know exactly where my current pain points are. They're not there because I don't think in Spanish. They're there because certain structures still require more repetitions. For example, if I want to say, he was here the other day, I need to quickly decide whether that situation calls for fue or estaba. That's not a thinking problem. That's a structure problem. Or if I want to say I would do it if I had the time, I need immediate access to the conditional structure. Lo haría si tuviera tiempo. Again, that's not a thinking problem. It's a recall problem. Or if I want to say I hope that it had rained, but it didn't, now I'm dealing with more advanced structures involving the subjunctive. Once again, the issue isn't that I'm sitting there thinking in English. The issue is whether I built enough repetitions to access the structure automatically. That's why I spend so much time talking about structured recall. The goal isn't to memorize sentences. The goal is to strengthen structures because nobody has time to memorize every sentence they'll ever need. Instead, you learn patterns, you learn frameworks, you learn relationships, and then you reuse those structures in thousands of new situations. That's what makes spontaneous speech possible, not some magical moment where you finally decide to think in Spanish. The reason I feel so strongly about this is because I think learners waste a lot of mental energy chasing abstract goals. They worry about whether they're thinking in Spanish, they worry about whether they're translating, they worry about whether they're doing language acquisition correctly. Meanwhile, the real solution is usually much simpler. Build stronger associations, get more repetitions, strengthen the structures that are slowing you down, and let automaticity happen on its own. Because in my experience, fluency isn't something you force, it's something that emerges after enough correct repetitions. Anyway, if this video made the phrase just think in Spanish feel a little less useful and a lot more questionable, be sure to give this video a like. And until the next time, good luck on your journey toward more usable functional Spanish. Peace.